Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi and welcome to the ISO Show. In today's episode, I'm going to be explaining what the difference is between certification and verification. Our loyal ISO Show listeners will be very familiar with the term certification, and it's been mentioned several times on this podcast, both with people that I've interviewed and also when we've been talking about the implementation of standards. And for many of you, it's going to be used in your vocabulary on a daily basis, especially if you're a certification body assessor, which I know a number of our assessors that listen in and certification bodies are avid listeners to the ISO Show. So, hello and welcome if you're one of those people that work for a certification body. Great to have you listening into the podcast, along with all the other businesses that are out there globally that tune into this podcast every week. So, obviously, this isn't just about certification. When we've covered podcasts on carbon standards, such as ISO 14064, or more recently on ISO 14068, the new net zero standard, I've been talking about verification, not certification. So I thought it was high time that I explain the difference between certification and verification, because there is a very clear distinction between them both. So let's begin with certification, which is most commonly used. Well, quite simply, certification is for businesses who wish to certify an ISO management system. So a company wishing to implement a quality management system, let's say, to ISO 9001, they would get the ISO system certified for their business. Verification, however, is very different. Verification is a confirmation of a claim through the provision of objective evidence that specified requirements have been fulfilled. Now that sentence has been literally taken from one of the standards that I'm going to be referring to today, which is all about verification of standards. So therefore, standards such as ISO 14064, the carbon footprint verification standard, is a standard that is verified, not certified. The claim, or statement, is typically the QES, so qualifying explanatory statement, for those of you that aren't familiar with what the claim or statement should look like. And if you'd like to hear more about this, because I'm not going to go into detail on the statement or claim today, but if you'd like to find out more information about this, then check out episodes 91 to 97, where David Algar, who's the principal carbonologist at Carbonology, explains this in a lot more detail. So I thought it would be good to set the record straight and to avoid any confusion and to provide some clarification between certification and verification, as we're starting to hear organisations and even certification bodies in some cases referring to certification for ISO 14064, the carbon footprint verification standard, or PAS 2060, the carbon neutrality standard. And technically, this is incorrect, as a certificate is not issued and they're not certified. And one of the reasons that I started this podcast a couple of years ago was to help to dispel myths, to share tips, and to basically to set the record straight in some areas, and obviously to get successful businesses onto the podcast to talk about their journeys in relation to ISO standards. I mean, the way that I like to describe verification is a bit like a car MOT. It's actually very different, but people seem to get this. So if you imagine, an MOT, it's an annual check that a claim is correct. Okay, so somebody's gone in, they've looked under the bonnet, they've checked the tyres, everything's in working order. Yep, we can claim that as of that moment, that car is basically fit to drive. There is a claim that it is roadworthy. So you could say that the verification claims on verification footprint, for example, for that 12-month period, it is a review of the historical data that claim is correct. And I'll come on to explain about how that's done in a moment. So you might be wondering about the difference when it comes to accreditation of certification bodies and verification bodies. So just to kind of touch that subject then. So for certification, the standard is ISO 17021, 2015. And this standard basically provides the requirements for bodies providing audit and certification of management systems. So this would typically apply to accredited certification bodies like BSI or NQA. And there are many others out there. You just need to go onto for example, in the UK, if you're listening in the UK, you go onto the UCAS website, UKAS. For other countries, you go onto the National Accreditation Body website, and they will basically be able to show you which certification bodies are actually certified against 17021. So they're the rules ultimately for certification bodies. 17021 provides the principles, it provides the requirements that sets out the competency, the consistency and impartiality of bodies that provide those audit and certification to all types of management systems. So verification bodies have a different standard, they have a different set of rules, and that's a standard called ISO 17029, which was published in 2019. And that standard's title is Conformity Assessment, General Principles and Requirements for Validation and Verification Bodies. So, why is it important that these standards are in place? Well, they provide structure and they provide governance to basically ensure that standards are either certified or verified to a level playing field. Unfortunately, there are some fake third-party so-called certification and verification bodies that offer certification and verification, but ultimately they're playing by their own rules. So, of course, there's a bit of a danger there when it comes to integrity and impartiality, because they're not ultimately playing by the rules and they just may not even be aware of the international standards. So it's just something to be aware of. So let's look at breaking down the difference between certification and verification in a bit more detail. So firstly, certification. So certification of an ISO management system, such as an environmental management system standard for ISO 14001, quality or information security management system, is basically for an organisation. And it's a means of providing assurance that the organisation has implemented a system, so they've got the policies, procedures and controls in place against the relevant activities for their products and services to be delivered in line with the company's own policies and procedures, and of course in alignment with the respective international management system standard. And certification of a management system provides that independence, that impartiality, that the company is actually doing what they say that they're doing and that it's effectively implemented. Now, I have covered this in several podcasts, but ultimately for those that are very new to certification, if you wanted to get certified for your organisation, basically a company needs to undertake a certification audit. It's also known as an assessment, and typically this is done in two parts. A stage 1 assessment is a document review, and stage 2 assessment is the evidence to prove that the company is following its policies and procedures. And I have recorded a podcast previously on what to expect during a certification body assessment, so I'd recommend going back into the archives to check that out. So verification. Well, I've actually found two definitions for verification because I just wanted to make sure that I was factually correct when I was talking about verification, of course. And this is in relation to standard BSEN ISO 14064 Part 3, which is the specification with guidance for the verification and validation of greenhouse gas statements. And also ISO 14065, which are the requirements for validation and verification bodies. Both definitions are actually very similar. So one refers to verification as the process for evaluating a statement of historical data and information to determine the statement is materially correct and conforms to criteria in 3.6.10, which I won't go into detail on that. But ultimately, it's the criteria that you are basically making the claim against. And the other definition, which again is very similar, is that it's a confirmation of a claim through a provision of objective evidence that specified requirements have been fulfilled. There are a couple of notes with that, and for those of you that have read a standard, there quite often are a couple of notes. So it's supplementary information. And note 1 is that verification is considered to be a process for evaluating a claim based on historical data and information to determine whether the claim is materially correct and conforms with specified requirements. Again, that's where we're cross-referencing the two standards actually. And note 2 is verification is applied to claims regarding events that have already occurred or results that have already been obtained, confirmation of truthfulness. So I just wanted to highlight that, confirmation of truthfulness. There's a lot of greenwashing going on at the moment, a lot of claims that we don't actually know whether they're true or not. So I think now more than ever is the time to actually have systems in place to be able to verify that claims are factually correct. And again, the common thing with these definitions is that it is past events. So you can only make a claim for a certain period. And again, that's similar to the MOT example I gave earlier. Now, interestingly, when I was reading through ISO 14068, the new net zero standard, that's a shortened version of it. You need to go back and listen to the last couple of podcasts when we were talking about 14068. Well, when I was reading through the standard when it came out at the end of last year, I noticed that there were actually 17 references to verification, and these were primarily in relation to ISO 14064, the carbon footprint verification standard. So I think the emphasis is very much on verification of a company's carbon footprint before you can start that pathway to net zero. But I think we'll cover that in another podcast. So what's actually involved with verification? And how does a verifier verify that the confirmation of a claim based on historical data has actually been fulfilled? Well, in accordance with the standards, verification activities and techniques include, I think there are over a dozen different ways for verifiers to gather evidence. And I'll just name a couple of them. A couple of them are actually you would expect to see in an assessment, which is observation, inquiry, confirmation, sampling. But the rest of them I believe, are unique to this particular requirement for verification. So analytical testing is one, confirmation, recalculation, examination, retracing, control testing, estimate testing, cross-checking and reconciliation. So when you hear about those words, it is very analytical. You know it's about numbers, you know it's about the data. And that is one of the key differentiators, I think, between verification and certification. So you can't expect an assessor that's qualified in assessing against ISO 14001 to automatically be competent in terms of being a verifier for ISO 14064 or 14068. It is a totally different ballgame. So finally, I'd just like to kind of end with just a summary of where I think we're at in terms of the status of verification in the UK and overseas. Well, as you know, I'm CEO of Blackmores, a consultancy firm that specialises in implementing and supporting businesses to achieve and maintain high standards in relation to ISO standards, and also CEO of Carbonology, which is basically the organisation that specialises in carbon standards. And what we're seeing across both businesses is that there is still a very high demand for organisations that are looking to achieve certification to ISO standards such as 14001 and 50001. And in a previous episode, I did mention about the global demand for those standards based on the ISO.org annual survey. But interestingly, although we're seeing demand for those standards in terms of being accredited, we're not necessarily seeing the same demand for verification. What we are seeing is a demand for organisations to demonstrate their carbon footprint credentials through independent verification. So that's not necessarily third party at this stage in the game. But what we are seeing is that demand for independence, so independent verification by an impartial and independent second party organisation. So I hope that's helped to provide some clarity around the difference between certification and verification. If you'd like to discuss verification to ISO 14064, the carbon footprint verification standard, or ISO 14068, the new standard for climate change management and transition to net zero, please go over to www.carbonologyhub.com to speak to carbon standards experts. And if you'd like to speak about any other ISO standards, if you have any inquiries or just like to, maybe a certain issue or concern that you have, then feel free to reach out to us at Blackmores. So that's www.blackmoresuk.com. So thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Looking to achieve certification to an ISO standard or just need a helping hand with ISO compliance? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com.